There are places in the Philippines where the veil between our world and the world of spirits is thin. Places where the old tales are not just stories told to frighten children, but living, breathing warnings whispered from one generation to the next. The province of Capiz is one such place. It is a land known for its haunting beauty, its lush fields, and its deep, dark rivers. But it is also known for something else. It is known as the heartland of the Aswang, a place where creatures of the night are said to roam freely once the sun has surrendered the sky. These stories are etched into the very soil, carried on the humid night air, and reflected in the cautious eyes of the elders who have seen too much to dismiss them as mere fantasy. They speak of duende hiding in termite mounds and tikbalang leading travelers astray in the forests. But of all the tales, none is more chilling than that of the Manananggal. The Manananggal. The name itself is a curse, a word spoken in hushed tones lest it be summoned. They say it appears as a beautiful woman by day, a neighbor, a friend, someone you might pass on the street without a second thought. But by night, a horrific transformation takes place. The creature grows leathery wings, its torso detaches from its lower body, and it takes to the sky, a grotesque silhouette against the moon. Its entrails dangle beneath it like gruesome vines, searching for its prey. It is a hunter of the unborn, the sick, and the dying, drawn to the scent of life it wishes to consume. For most, this is a legend, a terrifying piece of folklore. But for one family in the remote hamlet of Sitio Limot, this legend became a devastating reality in the year 2006. This is not a story I have read in a book. This is a story pieced together from hushed accounts, from fearful memories, from the very real terror that gripped a small, isolated community. It is a story of a visitor that did not arrive by foot but by air. A visitor that brought with it the stench of decay and a hunger that could not be satisfied. The events that unfolded in Sitio Limot serve as a stark reminder that some legends are not born of imagination, but of experience. They are warnings, passed down through blood and fear, to teach us what to do when the monsters we are told about as children decide to knock on our doors or worse, hover just outside our windows. This is the account of what happened when something ancient and malevolent set its sights on a single, unsuspecting family. The story begins, as many do, with a journey home. A journey born of duty and of love, but one that would lead to a confrontation with a darkness that had slept for generations. Our story is centered on a woman named Marites, who, at the time, was living a modern life in the bustling city, far removed from the superstitions of her youth. She had traded the chirping of crickets for the noise of traffic, the light of the stars for the glow of streetlights. But family obligation called her back to the place she was born, back to the quiet, eerie stillness of the province. She was returning to care for her ailing father, unaware that his sickness was not of the natural world, and that something else was waiting for her in the shadows of her childhood home. Sitio Limot was not just a place on a map, it was a place forgotten by time. Tucked away deep in the rural landscapes of Capiz, it was a small cluster of nipa huts accessible only by a long, winding dirt path that became impassable during the rains. There was no electricity to chase away the profound darkness of the night, no cell phone signal to connect its residents to the outside world. Life here was simple, governed by the rising and setting of the sun. The people of Sitio Limot lived closely with the land and with each other, their lives interwoven with the superstitions that had been passed down for centuries. It was into this world of isolation and ancient belief that Marites returned, her city sensibilities clashing with the quiet, unnerving rhythm of the province. She had come to care for her father Mang Ernesto, a man whose strength she had always known, now frail and fading in his bamboo bed. The first few days were a difficult adjustment for Marites. The silence of the night was not peaceful, it was heavy, filled with unfamiliar sounds that made the hair on her arms stand on end. The rustling in the kogan grass, the mournful call of a distant bird, the creaking of the bamboo walls of their small hut, every sound seemed amplified in the oppressive dark. Her father was weaker than she had imagined. He spoke in whispers, his eyes often darting towards the window as if expecting an unwelcome guest. The local albilario or folk healer had visited, prescribing herbs and chanting prayers, But Mang Ernesto's condition only seemed to worsen. He complained of a constant chill and a feeling of being drained, as if his very life force was being siphoned away from him while he slept. The neighbors were kind but cautious. They brought food and offered help, but their conversations were filled with cryptic warnings. "Be sure to keep the windows shut tight after dark," one elderly woman advised, her eyes wide with a meaning Marites did not yet understand. Another told her to place a bowl of rock salt and garlic on the windowsill, just in case. To Marita, these were the ramblings of a superstitious community, simple folk remedies for fears she had long outgrown. She was a woman of the city, a believer in science and medicine, not in the monsters that haunted the bedtime stories of her youth. She dismissed their concerns with a polite smile, attributing her father's decline to old age and the lack of proper medical facilities. She was wrong. Her world, built on logic and reason, was about to be shattered. The isolation of Sitio Limot was more than just a lack of modern amenities. It was a vulnerability. With no streetlights to pierce the darkness and no neighbors close enough to hear a scream, the small hut felt like a lonely island in a sea of encroaching shadows. Every evening, as dusk bled across the sky and painted the landscape in shades of purple and gray, a palpable sense of dread would descend upon the sitio. The villagers would retreat into their homes, bolting their doors and whispering prayers. Marites would light the family's single gas lamp, its flickering flame a small, defiant beacon against a vast, unnerving darkness. She did not know it yet, but that darkness was watching her. It was watching her father, and it was hungry. On her third night in Sitio Limot, the strangeness began to take a more definite shape. The air grew heavy and thick with an unspoken tension, a feeling that went beyond the simple quiet of the countryside. Marites was sitting by her father's bedside, combing her long hair in the dim, flickering light of the lamp. Mang Ernesto was asleep, his breathing shallow and labored. Outside, the usual symphony of insects had fallen silent, an abrupt and unsettling stillness that made the night feel hollow. It was in this profound silence that she heard the first sound. It was a soft, dragging noise, coming from directly above her. It sounded like something heavy and wet being pulled slowly across the nipa thatch of their roof. Her hand froze, the comb still tangled in her hair. She listened, her heart beginning to pound against her ribs. The dragging sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, replaced by a new, more terrifying noise. It was a slow, deliberate flapping. Flap, flap, flap. It was not the sound of a bird. It was too heavy, too leathery, the rhythm too slow and menacing. It sounded like massive wings beating against the humid night air, circling just above their home. Marites slowly rose to her feet, her gaze fixed on the ceiling as if she could see through the woven palm leaves. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. The stories she had dismissed, the warnings she had ignored, all came rushing back to her in a tidal wave of fear. The whispers of the Manananggal, the creature that flies in the night, no longer seemed like foolish folklore. The sound was real. It was right outside. She wanted to scream, to wake her father, to run out into the night and flee, but her body was paralyzed by a primal fear she had never known. The flapping sound continued for what felt like an eternity before slowly fading into the distance, leaving behind a silence that was even more terrifying than the noise itself. Marites stood frozen in the middle of the small room, listening, waiting. Had she imagined it? Was the isolation and stress playing tricks on her mind? She tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation, a large bat perhaps, a strange nocturnal bird. But deep in her soul, she knew what she had heard. It was the sound from the stories, the sound that every child in Capiz was taught to fear. That was the first sign. It was the creature's announcement of its presence. The following morning, Marites tried to convince herself it had been a dream, a nightmare brought on by exhaustion and worry. But the fear lingered, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. She did not mention the incident to her father, not wanting to frighten him further. She scanned the roof from the outside but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Yet the atmosphere had changed, the air felt charged, and the shadows in the corners of the hut seemed darker, deeper. She found herself glancing nervously at the windows and the door, a newfound respect for the neighbor's warnings taking root in her heart. She did not know it then, but this was only the beginning. The visitor from the night before was merely testing the house, scouting its prey. The true horror had not yet begun, and the signs would soon become impossible to ignore. Marites settled into a fragile routine, a rhythm dictated by the needs of her ailing father and the oppressive quiet of Sitio Limot. The days were spent boiling herbs, changing her father's linens, and forcing him to sip broth he had little appetite for. She tried to fill the silence with small talk, recounting stories from the city, speaking of busy streets and bright lights that felt a world away. But her words seemed to be swallowed by the thick, humid air of the province, leaving an unnerving stillness in their wake. The isolation was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on her from the moment the sun began its descent. She was a stranger in her own home, haunted by the unfamiliar sounds and the creeping dread that came with the darkness. The memory of the flapping wings was a wound in her mind, one she could not dismiss as easily as she had the superstitions of the villagers. On her third night, the true strangeness began solidifying the fear that had been a faint whisper in her thoughts. She was sitting by her father's bedside, combing her long dark hair in the weak flickering glow of the single gas lamp. Mang Ernesto was asleep, his breathing a shallow, rattling sound in the otherwise silent hut. Suddenly the chirping of the crickets and the croaking of the frogs ceased. An abrupt, profound quiet fell over the land, as if the very world outside was holding its breath. It was in that deafening silence that she heard it, a soft, dragging sound from directly above. It was the sound of something heavy and wet, being pulled slowly across the nipa thatch of their roof. Her hand froze mid-stroke, the comb tangled in her hair as she strained to listen, her heart beginning a frantic panic rhythm against her ribs. The dragging stopped as suddenly as it had begun, replaced by a sound that would forever be burned into her memory. It was a slow, deliberate flapping. Flap, flap, flap. This was no bird. The sound was too heavy, too leathery, the rhythm too slow and menacing. It was the sound of massive, powerful wings beating against the night air, circling just above their small, vulnerable home. Marites rose to her feet, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as if she could see through the woven palm leaves to the horror that lurked above. A cold sweat beaded on her forehead. The stories she had so confidently dismissed, the warnings she had politely ignored, all came rushing back in a tidal wave of pure primal terror. The whispers of the Manananggal, the creature that severs its body to fly in the night, no longer seemed like foolish folklore. The sound was real. It was right outside. She wanted to scream, to wake her father, to bolt from the hut and run blindly into the night. But her limbs were locked in place, paralyzed by a fear so profound it stole the air from her lungs. The dreadful flapping continued for what felt like an eternity before it began to recede, fading slowly into the distance until only the heavy silence remained. The silence now felt even more terrifying than the noise it had replaced. Marites stood frozen in the center of the room, every nerve ending alight, listening, waiting. Had she imagined it? Was the isolation and stress finally fracturing her sanity? She tried to rationalize it, to grasp for a logical explanation. A large fruit bat, a strange nocturnal bird lost from its flock. But deep in her soul, in the part of her that remembered the old ways, she knew what she had heard. It was the sound from the stories. It was the first warning. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the gaps in the bamboo walls, a welcome but weak defense against the lingering chill of the night before. Marites tried to convince herself it had all been a terrible dream, a nightmare conjured by exhaustion and worry. She avoided looking at the roof, afraid of what she might or might not see. She did not speak of it to her father, who seemed even weaker than the day before, his skin pale and clammy to the touch. She went about her morning chores with a forced, brittle cheerfulness, but the fear was a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. The world outside the hut no longer looked the same. The rustling of the banana leaves in the breeze sounded like whispers, and the shadows beneath the great balete tree at the edge of the property seemed darker, more menacing. Later that day, an elderly neighbor, ailing courting, came by with a small pot of lugao, a warm rice porridge. As Marites accepted the food, the old woman's eyes darted around the small hut, lingering on the windows and the door. "You must be careful, Marites," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The moon is growing full. It is a dangerous time." She leaned closer, her wrinkled face a mask of genuine concern. "They say it is drawn to the sick. It can smell the weakness from far away. It will test the house first, to see if the way is clear." Ailing Courting's words were a direct echo of the terror Marites had experienced, validating her fear and making it impossible to dismiss. The old woman's superstitions now sounded like wisdom, a truth Marites was only beginning to understand. Ailing Courting instructed her to gather sharp bamboo stakes and place them beneath the windows. "And garlic," she insisted, pressing a whole head of it into Marites' hand. "Hang it on the door. Its smell is an insult to them." Before she left, she looked at Mang Ernesto lying still in his bed and made the sign of the cross. "Pray," she whispered, "and do not look out the window after dark no matter what you hear." The visit left Marites shaken. The community's fear was not just a collection of old wives' tales, it was a defense mechanism, a set of rules for survival in a place where the line between the natural and supernatural was dangerously thin. The warnings were not meant to scare, but to protect. That evening, as dusk settled over Sitio Limot, Marites followed the old woman's advice. She felt foolish, but the memory of the leathery flapping was too vivid to ignore. She sharpened bamboo sticks with a kitchen knife, her hands trembling slightly, and pushed them into the soft earth beneath each window. She hung strings of garlic on the main door, its pungent aroma filling the small space. Each action was a concession, an admission that the logical world she came from had no power here. This was a different reality, governed by different laws. As she lit the single gas lamp, its flame felt smaller than ever, a tiny defiant spark against an immense encroaching darkness that was no longer empty. It was watching, it was waiting, and it would be back. The signs escalated over the next few days, becoming more direct, more malevolent. One morning Marites woke to the sound of their neighbor's dog howling, a mournful, distressed sound that cut through the morning calm. Later, the dog was found dead near the edge of their property. There were no visible wounds, no signs of a struggle, but its body was cold and strangely deflated, as if it had been drained of all its blood, of its very life. The villagers who gathered spoke in hushed, fearful tones, their eyes glancing towards Marites' hut. They knew what it meant. The creature had been thwarted by the garlic and the stakes, and in its frustration, it had taken its anger out on the dog. It was a message, a promise of what was to come. Inside the hut, a new and deeply unsettling element had appeared. A faint, sickeningly sweet smell began to permeate the air, a scent like rotting meat or decaying flowers. Marites would clean obsessively, searching for the source, but it was nowhere and everywhere at once. It was strongest near her father's bed, clinging to the blankets and the mat. Mang Ernesto himself seemed to be deteriorating at an alarming rate. He had developed a fever that would not break and began to speak of vivid nightmares. He claimed a woman with long, dark hair would visit him in his dreams, her eyes glowing like embers, her breath cold on his skin. He said she would whisper to him, telling him to give up, to let go, that his time was over. The dragging sounds on the roof returned each night, more insistent now, accompanied by a scratching at the bamboo walls, like long fingernails trying to find a way in. Marites would lie awake for hours, her body rigid with fear, listening to the sinister sounds and the shallow, rattling breaths of her father. The house no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a cage, a baited trap with her and her father inside. The albulario returned, his face grim. He burned incense that filled the hut with acrid smoke and painted crosses on the door and windows with a strange dark oil. He confirmed their worst fears. "It has marked him," the old healer said, his voice low and solemn. "The Manananggal has chosen this house. It can smell the sickness, and it will not leave until it has fed." The feeling of being watched was constant and suffocating. During the day, Marites would catch glimpses of movement at the edge of her vision, a shadow flitting between the trees, a shape that vanished the moment she turned to look. At night, the presence was a palpable force just outside the thin walls of their home. It was a pressure against the air, a silent, hungry intelligence focusing all of its will on the small, lamp-lit room. Marites began lining the windowsills with rock salt, just as Ailing Courting had advised. She was no longer a skeptical city dweller. She was a daughter fighting a war against a creature from myth, using ancient weapons of salt, garlic, and prayer. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that these defenses would not hold for long. A confrontation was inevitable. The breaking point came on the seventh night. A storm had rolled in from the sea, and a torrential rain hammered down on the nipa roof, masking the usual nocturnal sounds. The wind howled like a grieving spirit, making the bamboo walls of the hut creak and groan. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with dread. Mang Ernesto was delirious, muttering incoherently, his body trembling with fever. Marites was sitting up, unable to sleep, her gaze fixed on the flickering lamp. Every crash of thunder made her jump, her nerves stretched to their absolute limit. The rain and wind were a chaotic symphony, but underneath it all, Marites felt that same familiar presence. It was out there, using the storm as cover. Around 2 a.m, during a brief lull in the wind, she heard it, a soft tapping sound, right on the wooden shutter of the window nearest her father's bed. It was not the rain, It was a deliberate, rhythmic tap, 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 like a fingernail against wood. Her blood ran cold. She remembered Ailing Cording's warning, do not look out the window no matter what you hear. But the tapping was hypnotic, insistent. It was a summons. Slowly, as if in a trance, Marites rose from her stool. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of the storm. She took a hesitant step towards the window, then another. She had to know. She had to see the face of the evil that was tormenting her family. With a trembling hand she reached for the edge of the wooden shutter. She pulled it open just a crack, peering into the rain-swept darkness. And then she saw it. For a terrifying, eternal second, she was face to face with the monster. It was a woman's upper torso, floating impossibly in the stormy air, its skin pale and luminous in the dark. Long black hair was plastered to its face by the rain, and its eyes glowed with a faint, malevolent red light, filled with an ancient, insatiable hunger. Below its severed waist, its entrails and organs dangled like grotesque writhing vines, glistening wetly in the night. It was the Manananggal. It was real, and it was smiling at her, a wide, predatory smile that revealed sharpened teeth. A scream tore from Marites' throat, a raw animal sound of pure horror. The creature's smile vanished, replaced by a snarl of fury. It lunged towards the window, its long, thin tongue, like that of a snake, flicking out towards the gap. Acting on pure instinct, Marites slammed the shutter closed and threw her entire body weight against it. On the other side, the creature shrieked, a high-pitched, unholy sound that was barely distinguishable from the howling wind. It clawed and scratched at the wood, its rage a palpable force. Marites fumbled for the bowl of rock salt on the sill and hurled handfuls of it through the cracks in the window. The screeching intensified, turning into a sound of agony, and then she heard it again. The heavy, leathery flapping of wings as the creature retreated into the storm. Marites collapsed to the floor, shaking uncontrollably. The image of those glowing red eyes burned forever into her mind. The hunt was over. The siege had begun. The morning after the storm broke with a deceptive calm. The sky was washed clean, and the humid air smelled of wet earth and fresh rain. But for Marites, the world had been permanently altered. The terror of the previous night was not a nightmare to be shaken off with the daylight. It was a memory seared into her mind, as real and solid as the bamboo floor beneath her feet. The image of the floating torso, the glowing red eyes, and the dangling entrails was a truth she could no longer deny or rationalize away. The monster from the stories was real, and it had been at her window. The fight for her father's life was not against a simple sickness. It was a battle against a predator from a world she had refused to believe in. Her skepticism had been violently stripped away, leaving behind a raw, chilling certainty. She forced herself to go outside, her movements stiff with dread. She needed proof, something tangible to hold on to in the light of day. Her eyes were drawn to the window where the creature had appeared. There, in the soft mud churned up by the rain, were strange marks. They were not footprints. They were a series of shallow, parallel gouges in the earth, as if something sharp had scraped against the ground directly beneath the window. And there was something else. A few dark, viscous drops stained the mud, smelling faintly of brine and something else. Something rotten. It was as if the creature, in its pained retreat from the salt, had left a physical trace of its unholy nature behind. This was the proof she needed. This was the confirmation that the horror was not just in her mind. Later that morning, their neighbor's son came running to their hut, his face pale with shock. He led Marites to the edge of the property, to the family's small chicken coop. The bamboo latch was broken, splintered from the outside. Inside, a grim scene awaited them. 3 of their chickens were dead, their bodies lying limp on the dirt floor. There were no bite marks, no torn feathers, no signs of a struggle with a typical predator like a wildcat or a snake. Instead, each chicken had a small, precise puncture wound on its neck. Their bodies were cold and felt strangely light, almost hollow. They had been drained, just like the neighbor's dog. The creature denied its intended prey, had settled for a lesser meal, its hunger driving it to an almost careless display of its power. The sight of the lifeless chickens sent a fresh wave of terror through Marites. This was not just a stalker, it was a hunter, and it was getting bolder. The attacks were escalating, moving closer to the house, a clear and deliberate tightening of the noose. The initial sounds on the roof had been a test. The appearance at the window had been an attempt. This latest act was a message, a grim promise of its persistence. It would not be deterred by simple defenses. It would not give up. Marites realized with a sickening lurch that the salt and garlic were merely temporary measures. They were not a wall. They were a fragile fence that the creature was now actively trying to tear down. She was running out of time, and the night would soon fall again. A foul, untraceable stench invaded Marites' home, growing stronger each night despite her desperate cleaning. The odor clung to the walls thickest where her feverish father lay, and seemed to seep from the earth itself. Mang Ernesto, delirious, muttered of a woman with burning eyes and a grave-scented breath, her tongue reaching for him in the dark. The stench peaked at night, a sign of the Manananggal's presence saturating their home with supernatural decay. Villagers, fearful, left offerings at the doorstep, whispering that the house was marked by a beast. Marites realized the creature was not just haunting them, it was turning their home into its own lair. Each night the sounds grew more violent, scrabbling claws tearing at the roof, relentless scratching along the bamboo walls. Marites lay frozen, listening as the creature tested every weakness, its patience thinning. By morning, deep gouges scarred the walls, proof of the monster's power and intent. The house, once a sanctuary, was now a prison marked by the Manananggal. Neighbors hurried past, crossing themselves, the fear now a visible scar on the community. For Marites, each new scratch was a countdown, their defenses would not hold forever. Desperate, Marites summoned Mang Isco, the albilario, who immediately sensed the evil at work. He revealed the Manananggal was already feeding, its tongue slipping through cracks to drain Mang Ernesto's life. Mang Isco anointed Ernesto with protective oil, warning it would only buy time and anger the creature. The only hope find and destroy the Manananggal's hidden lower half before dawn. If they succeeded, the monster would perish in the sunlight. Mang Isco declared, "Tonight, we follow it, we end this." The hunt would begin as soon as the creature struck. Mang Isco's plan spread panic and resolve through the sitio. Armed with bolos, bamboo spears, garlic and salt, the bravest men gathered, determined to fight the nightmare. Women and children huddled in prayer, the entire community united by ancient fear and desperate hope. Mang Isco instructed the men, wait for the creature, follow its flight and search the shadows for its hidden body. Do not meet its eyes, do not listen to its voice, find the body, he warned. The fate of Mang Ernesto and the sitio hung in the balance. As darkness fell, the hunt was set to begin. On the night of the hunt, Sitio Limot was silent, the moon casting an eerie glow. Marites waited inside, surrounded by incense and hope, while the men hid outside, weapons ready. Mang Isco meditated, warning that the creature's rage would make it reckless and vulnerable. Every sound was agony, every shadow a threat. Then, the dreaded flapping began, closer, more determined than ever. Mang Isco's eyes snapped open, the men tensed. The siege had begun. The Manananggal was coming for them. The flapping sound grew deafeningly loud, culminating in a heavy thud on the nipa roof directly above them. The entire hut seemed to shudder from the impact. This was no longer a stealthy approach, it was a declaration of war. A furious, guttural hissing sound came from the roof, a sound of pure, venomous rage. It was the sound of a predator discovering its meal was poisoned. The creature was enraged by the protective oil and incense, its frustration just boiling over. Marites flinched, pressing herself back against the wall, her eyes wide with terror. She could feel the malevolent presence above them, a palpable weight of ancient hatred pressing down on the fragile structure of their home. The scratching started again, but this time it was a frenzied, violent tearing at the thatch. The creature's fury was a terrifying thing to behold. It shrieked, a high-pitched, unholy sound that pierced the night, a scream of frustration and hunger. It scrambled across the roof, its movements heavy and unnatural, before launching itself into the air again. It circled the hut once, its massive shadow passing over the moonlit ground before it zeroed in on its target. There was a loud bang against the wooden shutter of the window nearest Mang Ernesto's mat. Then another. The creature was physically attacking the house, ramming its body against the weak points, trying to break its way in through sheer brute force. Marites stared at the rattling shutter, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she felt dizzy. Suddenly, the ramming stopped. An eerie silence fell, broken only by the shallow, rattling breaths of her father. Marites held her breath, straining to hear. A soft scraping sound began at the edge of the window shutter. Slowly, a long, pale finger with a blackened, sharp nail inserted itself into the thin gap between the shutter and the frame. It twisted, trying to pry the window open. Marites was frozen, horrified, watching the grotesque finger work at the latch. She remembered Mang Isco's words, a desperate, silent prayer. He had told her this would happen, that its rage would make it careless. This was the moment. She had to see it. She had to give the men outside a target. With a final splintering crack, the shutter was forced open just a few inches, and there, framed in the narrow opening, was the face of the Manananggal. It was even more horrific up close than she could have ever imagined. Its skin was a luminous, corpse-like white, stretched tight over its skull. Its hair, long and black, floated around its head like a dark halo, but its eyes were the true source of its terror. They were not human. They were glowing pits of crimson fire burning with a hunger that was ancient and absolute. Its lips peeled back in a snarl, revealing rows of sharpened, needle-like teeth. For a heart-stopping second, its glowing red eyes met hers, and in them she saw nothing but a void of pure, predatory evil. The moment her eyes locked with the creature's, a scream tore from Marites' throat. It was not a sound of fear alone, but of horror, of revulsion, of a mind breaking against an impossible reality. It was a raw, primal shriek that shattered the night's silence. The sound acted like a signal. Outside, torches flared to life as the men broke from their cover, their own shouts echoing Marites' scream. The Manananggal, startled by the sudden light and noise, recoiled from the window with another enraged hiss. Its head whipped around, its glowing eyes fixing on the approaching men, its expression twisting from predatory hunger to pure, murderous fury. It had been ambushed. It knew it had been lured into a trap. The creature unleashed a sound that was not of this world. It was a long, guttural screech that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the air, a sound of pure hatred that promised a painful death to all who dared to challenge it. It launched itself backwards from the hut, its dangling entrails swinging grotesquely in the torchlight. For the first time, the men got a clear view of the monster in its entirety. It was a nightmare given form, a profane mockery of the human body, an upper torso that flew on leathery bat-like wings, its spine and organs trailing beneath it like the tentacles of some abyssal jellyfish. Several of the younger men faltered, their courage momentarily failing them in the face of such an abomination. But Mangisco's voice cut through the chaos. "Huwag kayong matakot, do not be afraid," he bellowed, stepping out from the hut, a bolo knife gleaming in his hand. "It is just a beast, follow it, remember the plan." His voice, steady and powerful, seemed to break the creature's spell. The men rallied, their fear replaced by a surge of adrenaline and grim purpose. The Manananggal, seeing the mob of armed villagers advancing, let out one last, frustrated shriek and beat its powerful wings, ascending rapidly into the night sky. It did not flee in a straight line. It circled once more, its glowing red eyes sweeping over the scene, as if trying to memorize the faces of those who had defied it. Then, with a final powerful flap of its wings, it shot off into the darkness, heading east towards a dense grove of old banana trees and a massive ancient balete tree that stood near the abandoned schoolhouse at the edge of the sitio. "There!" shouted one of the men, pointing with his spear. "It goes to its hiding place!" Mangisco nodded grimly. "Hobble! Follow it!" he commanded. "Do not let it out of your sight! Marites, stay here! Salt the windows and pray for your father! And for us!" The hunt was on. The men, a moving constellation of torchlight, plunged into the darkness, chasing the winged horror, their shouts and the sound of their running feet fading into the distance. Left alone in the hut with her delirious father and the lingering stench of the creature, Marites felt a new kind of terror settle over her. The immediate threat of the monster at her window was gone, but it was replaced by the dreadful uncertainty of the hunt. The men of the sitio were chasing a demon through the dark, armed with little more than sharpened steel and courage. She was helpless, her fate and her father's now in their hands. The sounds of the chase grew fainter, leaving her in a silence that felt heavy and suffocating. She rushed to the window the creature had forced open, her hands shaking as she slammed the damaged shutter closed, ramming a small stool against it to keep it shut. Remembering Mangisco's final command, she grabbed the clay bowl of coarse rock salt. Her fear gave way to a frantic, desperate energy. She moved around the small hut like a priestess performing a sacred rite, pouring generous lines of salt along every windowsill, across the threshold of the door, and even pushing grains into the cracks in the bamboo walls. Each grain of salt was a prayer, a tiny white shield against the overwhelming darkness. She could still feel the creature's presence lingering in the air, its rage and hatred a psychic stain on their home. The salt was her only weapon, her only way to fight back, to reinforce the fragile defenses while the real battle raged outside. She returned to her father's side. Mang Ernesto was still tossing and turning, caught in his fever dream, but his muttering seemed to have eased slightly. Marites wondered if the creature's departure had lessened its psychic hold on him. She dipped a cloth in cool water and placed it on his forehead, whispering words of comfort that were as much for herself as for him. "They will get it, Tate," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They will not fail, you have to hold on, just hold on a little longer." She looked at his frail form, at the man who had always been her protector, now so helpless. A fierce, protective instinct rose within her, hardening her resolve. She would not let that thing have him. Minutes stretched into an eternity. From the distance she could hear faint, sporadic shouts, but she couldn't tell what was happening. Was it a cry of victory or of pain? She began to pray, her lips forming the words of the rosary her mother had taught her as a child, words she hadn't spoken in years. The prayers were a lifeline in the suffocating darkness, a familiar rhythm to hold on to, while the fate of her father and her community was decided in the shadows. She prayed for the safety of the men, she prayed for the dawn to come quickly, and she prayed that the unholy scream she had heard from the creature would be the last sound it ever made. The chase was a chaotic, desperate scramble through the darkness. The men, guided by torchlight and the moon, followed the dark, winged shape as it flew towards the overgrown grounds of the old, abandoned schoolhouse. The Manananggal was fast, but its flight seemed labored, less graceful than before. Mangisco theorized that the protective spells and the community's resistance were weakening it, draining its unholy energy. It flew low, its dangling entrails sometimes snagging on the high branches of trees, eliciting frustrated hisses from the creature. It was no longer a confident predator soaring through its domain. It was a panicked animal fleeing towards its lair, the hunter now finding itself the hunted. The creature finally disappeared into a particularly dense grove of banana trees that grew wild behind the derelict school building. A massive balete tree, its trunk gnarled and ancient, with aerial roots hanging down like a dense curtain, stood at the center of the grove. The men slowed as they approached, their torchlight cutting flickering paths through the oppressive darkness. This place was known to be enchanted, a place children were warned to avoid even in the daylight. "It is here," Mangisco whispered, his voice tense. "Spread out. Search carefully. It will be hidden at the base of a tree, covered by leaves. Look for something that does not belong." The men began their search, moving cautiously through the grove, the broad banana leaves rustling around them. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and decay. The tension was unbearable. Every shadow looked like a threat, every sound made them jump. They knew the upper half of the creature was likely lurking in the branches above, watching them, waiting for a chance to strike and defend its vulnerable other half. They checked the base of every banana tree, kicking aside piles of dried leaves, their eyes scanning for anything out of place. One of the younger men let out a yelp, having mistaken a large termite mound for the creature's body. It was Mangisco who found it. Under the thickest part of the balete tree's hanging roots, concealed beneath a carefully arranged pile of freshly cut banana leaves, was a sight of profound horror. It was the lower half of a woman's body, from the waist down, standing upright as if it had been planted in the earth. The skin was pale and cool to the touch, and at the waist, where the torso should have been, was a clean, flat surface of severed muscle and bone, glistening wetly in the torchlight. There was no blood. It was a sight so bizarre, so contrary to nature, that it stunned the men into silence. They had found it. They had found the Manananggal's weakness, its anchor to the mortal world. Now they had to destroy it before its other half returned. The men gathered around the balete tree, their torchlight converging on the grotesque discovery. The sight of the dismembered lower body standing so unnaturally in the dark was a violation of all known laws of nature. It was a testament to the creature's profane power, a quiet, horrifying piece of evidence left behind in its nightly hunt. Mangisco pushed aside the last of the banana leaves, revealing the full horror. The flesh was pale and clammy, yet it was not dead. A faint, almost imperceptible pulse seemed to throb from the severed waist, a slow, dark life that connected it to its flying other half. This was the creature's anchor, its vulnerable secret, and now it was exposed to the torchlight and the cold steel of their bolo knives. A low growl from the branches above reminded them they were not alone. The upper half of the Manananggal was lurking in the darkness of the balete tree's canopy, its glowing red eyes watching their every move. It could not attack them directly with its full strength, fearing they would damage its other half, but its hatred was a palpable force, pressing down on them from the shadows. It let out a low, warning hiss, a sound like air escaping a tomb, trying to frighten them away from its hidden body. The men instinctively looked up, their hands tightening on their weapons. But Mang Isko's sharp voice cut through their fear, refocusing their attention on the task at hand. "Do not be distracted by the beast in the branches," the albulario commanded, his voice steady and firm, a rock in the swirling sea of their terror. "Its threats are empty as long as we control this." He gestured with his bolo knife towards the standing legs. "It is bound to this vessel. It cannot stray far, and it cannot let us destroy it. Our courage is its cage. Now we must work quickly. The sun will rise in less than 2 hours, and we must finish this before it has a chance to rejoin." He opened his woven bag and began to pull out the items needed for the ritual of destruction: coarse rock salt, a small pouch of gray ash, and a bottle of pungent vinegar. The men formed a protective circle around Mang Isko and the severed body, their backs to the tree, their faces turned outward to the surrounding darkness. They held their torches and spears high, creating a perimeter of light and sharpened points. They were the guardians of this unholy ritual, a wall of human resolve against the monster that watched from above. The creature shrieked in fury as it saw Mang Isko prepare the salt, understanding what was about to happen. It was a shriek, not of aggression, but of dawning terror. The hunter that had stalked their village was now trapped, forced to watch as its own doom was meticulously prepared by the very mortals it had sought to terrorize. The first ingredient of the creature's destruction was salt. Mang Isko took a large handful of the coarse rock salt and began to sprinkle it generously over the severed waist of the lower body. The moment the first grains touched the pale flesh, a violent reaction occurred. The body convulsed, the legs kicking out spasmodically as if they had been struck by lightning. A pained, gurgling hiss echoed from the branches above, a sound of agony that was transmitted from the flying torso to its grounded half. The salt was like acid, searing the unholy tissues and corrupting the supernatural connection that held the two halves together. The men flinched, but held their ground, their knuckles white on their weapons. Next came the ash. The albulario explained that the ash, gathered from a sacred fire, served to purify the corrupted flesh, to erase the creature's claim on the mortal remains. He rubbed the fine gray powder into the salt, creating a thick, gritty paste that coated the entire wound. From above, the hissing turned into a desperate, pleading sound, a series of strange, guttural croaks and whimpers. The Manananggal was trying to communicate, perhaps to bargain, its voice a venomous whisper that slithered down from the leaves. "Pay it no mind," Mang Isko grunted, his face slick with sweat from the effort and the tension. "It is a liar. Its words are poison, meant to sow doubt and pity." The vinegar was the final insult. Mang Isko uncorked the bottle and poured the pungent liquid over the paste of salt and ash. The smell, sharp and acidic, filled the air, overpowering the scent of decay. The creature's body thrashed wildly now, the legs stumbling as if trying to run away. From the canopy, a shower of leaves and twigs rained down as the flying half thrashed about in a furious, helpless rage. It was trapped, unable to attack them for fear of its own body being knocked over and damaged, yet unable to flee. It was forced to watch as its anchor to the world was systematically desecrated, its immortality being unraveled grain by grain. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten, changing from the deep black of midnight to a faint, bruised purple. The race against the dawn was on. The men could feel the urgency mounting, their eyes darting from the writhing body on the ground to the lightening horizon. "It is time," Mang Isko said, his voice grim. He pulled out a small container of oil and a match. "We must burn it. The fire will sever the connection for good. When the sun rises, it will have no body to return to. It will be caught between the night and the day, and the light will finish it." The finality of his words hung in the cold air. The creature above fell silent, as if it understood that its final moments had arrived. Mang Isko carefully poured the oil over the salt and ash paste, the flammable liquid soaking into the mixture and dripping down the pale legs of the creature's lower half. The men in the circle tensed, their faces illuminated by the flickering torchlight, their expressions a mixture of fear and grim satisfaction. This was the point of no return. In the branches above, the Manananggal remained eerily quiet, a silent dark shape against the increasingly bright sky. It was as if the creature was gathering all its remaining energy, all its hatred, for one final desperate act. The air grew thick with anticipation, so heavy that it felt hard to breathe, the silence more terrifying than the previous shrieks. With a steady hand, the old albulario struck a match. The small flame sputtered to life, a tiny spark of man-made fire against the vast encroaching dawn. He held it for a moment, his lips moving in a final powerful prayer of banishment, a last rite for the unholy thing they were about to send back to whatever hell it had spawned from. He then touched the flame to the oil-soaked waist. The effect was instantaneous. The lower body erupted in a whoosh of bright orange flame, the fire greedily consuming the cursed flesh. The smell of burning oil and something else, something sickeningly sweet and foul, filled the air, forcing the men to take a step back. The moment the fire ignited the lower half, the creature in the tree broke its silence. It let out a sound that was not a shriek of rage, but a long, drawn-out wail of pure, unadulterated agony. It was the sound of its very essence being burned away, its connection to the physical world being violently severed by the flames. The men watched in horrified awe as the burning legs kicked and spasmed, the body stumbling and finally collapsing into the fire, which roared higher and hotter. The creature's wail intensified, a sound so filled with pain and despair that it seemed to shake the very leaves on the trees, a death cry that would haunt the dreams of every man present for the rest of their lives. The flying torso dropped from the canopy, crashing heavily through the lower branches. It was no longer flying, it was falling. It landed in a heap on the dark earth a short distance from the fire, its leathery wings twitching uselessly. It tried to drag itself forward, its long, thin arms clawing at the dirt, desperately trying to reach the pyre where its other half was being consumed. It was a pathetic, horrifying sight. The monster, once an apex predator of the night, was now a crippled, dying thing, crawling through the dirt, its glowing red eyes fixed on the fire. The trap had worked. The creature was broken. As the first true rays of sunlight pierced through the canopy, they fell upon the crawling, broken form of the Manananggal. The effect of the sacred light on its profane flesh was immediate and catastrophic. Its pale skin began to smoke and sizzle where the sunlight touched it, as if it were being splashed with acid. The creature let out another scream, this one higher and thinner than the last, a sound of sheer, unbearable torment. It writhed on the ground, trying to pull itself back into the shadows, but there was nowhere left to hide. The sun was rising, and its time in the world of darkness was over. Its wings began to curl and blacken at the edges, turning brittle like burnt paper. The men watched, frozen in a state of shock and awe, as the dawn enacted its final brutal judgment. The creature's body began to disintegrate before their eyes. Its skin cracked and split, revealing a dark, viscous fluid beneath that evaporated into foul-smelling smoke upon contact with the light. Its glowing red eyes flickered and dimmed, the ancient fire within them slowly being extinguished by the pure, clean light of morning. It was a slow, agonizing dissolution, a complete unmaking of a being that should never have existed. The monster that had reigned with terror over the night was being erased by the simple, inexorable arrival of the day. With its last ounce of strength, the creature lifted its head. Its face, now a horrifying ruin of blackened, peeling flesh, turned towards the distant village. It opened its mouth, and from its throat came a final, unholy scream. It was a sound that carried across the entire sitio, a long, guttural cry that was equal parts agony, hatred, and a final, desperate curse upon the people who had defeated it. It was a promise of vengeance from beyond the grave, a sound so potent with malice that it echoed across the hills and rice paddies, a final, terrifying farewell from the visitor from Sitio Limot. Then, as the scream faded, its body collapsed completely. In a matter of seconds, all that was left on the forest floor was a pile of fine, black ash, and a few scorched bones that quickly crumbled into dust. The stench of decay vanished, replaced by the clean, fresh scent of the morning. The fire consuming the lower half died down to smoldering embers. It was over. The silence that fell was profound and absolute, a peaceful stillness that the village had not known for weeks. The men stood motionless, breathing in the clean air, the horror of the night slowly receding as the warm light of the sun washed over them. The trap had been sprung, the ritual was complete, and the Manananggal was gone. As the sun climbed higher, casting its warm golden light over Sitio Limot, a profound and unfamiliar peace settled upon the land. The oppressive weight of fear that had suffocated the community for weeks had finally lifted, replaced by the clean, crisp air of a new morning. The men returned from the grove not as warriors but as tired farmers and fishermen, their faces smudged with ash and exhaustion, but their eyes holding a quiet light of victory. They carried with them the story of the creature's end, a tale of fire and sunlight that would be passed down for generations. The news spread quickly, and villagers emerged from their homes blinking in the bright sun as if waking from a long collective nightmare. The terror was over. The dawn had brought not just light but salvation. Back in the small nipa hut, Marites felt the change instantly. The foul stench of decay that had permeated every fiber of their home had vanished completely, leaving only the faint, clean scent of salt and the lingering smoke of the albulario's incense. She had heard the creature's final, agonizing scream echo across the hills, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the men had succeeded. She went to her father's side. Mang Ernesto's breathing was no longer shallow and rattling. It was deep and even. The fever that had consumed him had broken, and his skin, once pale and clammy, now had a touch of its former warmth. For the first time in weeks, he was truly resting, his sleep peaceful and untroubled by monstrous visitors. When Mang Ernesto finally awoke late that afternoon, the first thing he spoke of was a dream. He dreamt of a great darkness lifting from him, of a heavy weight being pulled from his chest. He felt weak, his body aching as if he had run a great distance, but the confusion and fear were gone from his eyes. He looked at Marites, his gaze clear and lucid, and a faint smile touched his lips. The life force that had been siphoned away from him was slowly beginning to return, the spiritual wound beginning to close. The albulario, Mang Isco, declared that the worst was over. The creature's influence was gone, and now, only natural healing remained. The recovery would be slow, but it would be a true recovery. The days that followed were quiet and reflective. The rhythm of life in Sitio Limot slowly returned to normal, but it was a new kind of normal. The community was bound together more tightly than ever, forged by the shared ordeal and the communal act of courage that had saved them. There was a story whispered that a woman from a neighboring barangay, a reclusive weaver known for her strange habits, had vanished without a trace on the same morning. Her small shack was found empty, with only the lingering smell of burnt ash remaining. No one asked too many questions. They simply accepted it as the final, closing chapter of their terror. The monster had a name and a face, and now, it was gone forever. Though peace had returned to Sitio Limot, the events of those terrifying nights left indelible scars on the minds of all who had endured them. The world was no longer the same simple place. The villagers now understood that the old stories were not just tales to frighten children around a fire, they were instruction manuals for survival, histories written in blood and fear. The line between myth and reality had been erased, and they were left with the chilling knowledge that monsters were real, and that they had lived for a time beside one. The men who had faced the creature in the banana grove were hailed as heroes, but they were also changed, their eyes holding a haunted look that only those who have stared into the abyss can possess. Marites found that she could not simply forget. The image of the Manananggal's face at her window, its glowing red eyes filled with an ancient hunger, was burned into her memory. The sound of its leathery wings, its unholy screech, the way it dissolved into ash in the morning sun. These were things she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She had come to Sitio Limot as a modern woman, a skeptic who had dismissed the old ways as foolish superstition. She had been forced to learn a brutal lesson, stripped of her certainties and confronted with a truth far more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. She could never go back to her old life, her old beliefs. The city, with its noise and its lights, seemed like a fragile illusion now. The physical evidence of the ordeal remained for a time. The deep scratches on the bamboo walls of their hut were a daily reminder of the creature's fury. The charred patch of earth behind the old schoolhouse where the ritual had taken place became a place of dread, a spot that villagers would avoid, making the sign of the cross as they hurried past. These marks served as monuments to their fight, visible proof of what had happened. They were a warning that while this particular evil had been vanquished, the darkness from which it spawned still existed. It was a reminder to never become complacent, to never forget the ancient rules of protection. Marites found a new purpose in the aftermath. She spent hours with Mang Isco, the old albulario, no longer dismissing his knowledge but absorbing it with a desperate thirst. She learned about the properties of herbs, the meaning of prayers, and the ways to create charms and wards against the creatures of the night. She learned about the different kinds of Aswang, their habits, their weaknesses, and the signs of their presence. The knowledge that had once seemed like folklore was now the most important wisdom she could possess. She was no longer just a daughter caring for her father. She was becoming something more, a guardian of the knowledge that had saved them all. Years passed. Mang Ernesto eventually regained his strength, living out his remaining days in peace, forever grateful for the daughter and the community that had refused to surrender him to the darkness. Marites, however, never returned to the city. Her life there, once so important, now seemed trivial and disconnected from the fundamental truths she had learned. She stayed in Sitio Limot, her transformation complete. The skeptical city girl was gone, replaced by a woman who understood the weight of the night and the power of the old ways. She became Mang Isko's apprentice, and after he passed away, she became the new healer and protector of the village. Her home, once the site of a terrifying siege, became a sanctuary of knowledge. The walls were now adorned with bundles of dried herbs, strings of garlic, and pouches of salt and ash. She kept the old traditions alive, teaching the younger generations not just how to plant rice, but how to recognize the signs of an unnatural presence, how to protect their homes, and why they should never dismiss the stories of their elders. She became the keeper of the memory, ensuring that the lessons learned from the visitor in 2006 would never be forgotten. Her presence was a comfort to the community, a living symbol of their resilience and their victory over the dark. She knew that the folklore was more than just stories. It was a warning system, a codex of survival passed down through generations. Each tale of a tikbalang or a kapre was a lesson about respecting the forest. Each story of a duende was a reminder to be mindful of the unseen world. And the terrifying legend of the Manananggal was the ultimate caution against a particular kind of evil, an evil that preys on the vulnerable and wears a human face. It teaches that the greatest monsters are those that hide in plain sight, and that the simplest things, salt, garlic, faith and courage, are often the most powerful weapons against them. And so, every single night, as dusk bleeds across the sky and the shadows grow long in Sitio Limot, Marites performs a small ritual. She walks the perimeter of her home, checking the bamboo stakes beneath the windows and sprinkling a fresh line of salt across her doorway. It is not just a habit born of past trauma, it is a duty, a sacred act of vigilance. She knows that the world is wide and the night is deep, and that other creatures may still lurk in the darkness. Her actions are a quiet declaration, a message to anything that might be watching from the trees. This house is protected, this village remembers, and we are not afraid.